Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of the Dunamis Webcast. This is Joshua here and you're going to watch me code for the next 10 minutes. In this episode, we'll be talking about JPA. In this episode, we'll do three things. Number one, define the object relational mappings for the learning management system. Number two, define the select queries that the project will need. Number three, code the select queries into the persistence layer. While we are talking about JPA, let's take a quick look at what is JPA. JPA stands for Java Persistence APIs. It does three things predominantly. First is it helps us build an object relational mapping. Number two, it gives us an interface called the entity manager, which helps us, among many other things, perform CRUD operations, which stands for create, read, update and delete operations on an entity. And number three, it helps us query the database using what we know as query methods. Let us go ahead and create the object relational mapping, or ORM, for the course object. When I say ORM, what I mean is we are creating a mapping between each attribute here to a column in the database. So we achieve this by first letting JPA know that course is an entity. We do that by adding an annotation called entity, which resides in javax.persistence. This will not do. As you can see, it's throwing an error. We will need a column in the database, which will be a primary key, which we can achieve by using the annotation ID. Let's take a look at the database by refreshing it. You'll notice that we have a new table called course. The columns in this table will exactly match the object in Java, and ID will be the primary key. A quick note on the ID column before we move on. We would want the primary key to be auto-generated and auto-incremented, saying 1, 2, 3 and so on, as and when we create a course. For that, we use an annotation called generated value, which auto-generates the primary key, and we say generation type dot identity as a strategy. Now you will see that when we try to insert a new record into course, that the ID will be generated. There are two more things we need to take care before we move on. We declare all the variables in the course object as private and create getters and setters. We use getters and setters so that we can access these attributes whenever we reference the object. We'll move on and do the same for the module entity. Before we proceed, there's something we need to take care of. You will notice that the attribute course is of type course, which is not a primitive data type. In the database, what needs to happen is, while creating the module table, it needs a foreign key to the course table. We achieve that by using a mapping. In this case, a many to one mapping and a join column, which defines the name of the column, which acts as a foreign key to the ID column in the course table. When we check the database, we see that the module table has been created. It has columns which are ID, module and course ID, the mapping which we created. We can see that there is a foreign key created on the table module column course ID to the table course. Now we've gone ahead and done whatever we did for the course and module object for all the other objects which we created in the previous episode. We first defined the class as an entity, and then we defined auto-generated ID. We put many to one mapping wherever there's a foreign key, and we have put down all the getters and setters for each object. These changes have been done to content, as we just saw. Enrollment, right here, enrollment status, person and student. Let's take a quick look at the foreign keys in the database. We can see there's one for content, one for module, two for enrollment, one to student and one to course, two for enrollment status, one to enrollment and one to content. With this, we are done with the object relational mapping. We've seen that the object model in Java maps to columns and tables in MySQL. JPA gives us an entity manager which allows to perform operations on these objects and subsequently the tables. Spring Boot gives us something a little more powerful called repositories, where we can do the same thing, perform CRUD operations and a little more on the objects and subsequently the database. It offers three kinds of repositories. One is a CRUD repository, a paging and sorting repository and a JPA repository. We in this example will be using the JPA repository. So what we'll now do is go ahead and create a JPA repository for course, and the JPA repository is going to allow us to perform CRUD operations, but now we'll be only looking at queries. How are we going to set up queries in the repository? So you go to the persistence package and create an interface and call it course repository. Extend the JPA repository. Here you say course and here I say integer. Now I'm all set to go ahead and create methods which will fetch data for me. So I say list course find all. This method is going to return an array of all courses by fetching it from the database. We can test this method by using the command line runner, and this method returns an array of courses, and we can loop through that array and display it right here. We'll now look at something a little bit more complex. We'll look at the module repository, which does the same thing as what we did for course, except that it contains a method which says get all by course ID. This basically is going to my database and fetch all the modules which have the course ID 1 if I pass 1 as the parameter. We can do this in a similar fashion as what we did for course, except that we'll call the method which we just wrote, pass 1 as parameter, loop through the modules and display it like this. Say get course and get module. It's going to display like this. We'll now look at the query functions that we'll be using for the learning management system. We've already written list courses and list modules by course. We'll now write list content by module, list enrollment by students and list content by the module along with the completion status. We have now gone ahead and created those repositories, one for content which has find all by module ID, one for enrollments which has find all by student ID, and for enrollment status we have find all by enrollment ID, which we will later group by module and display. That brings us to the end of this webcast. We defined the object relational model for the entire object model, and we wrote the query methods for accessing the database. The next webcast will be on the service layer. See you soon.